Greetings, warriors and dreamers. Welcome to the realms of sleep, where tonight we journey through the epic world of God of War. I am your guide through the 9 realms, where ancient gods whisper their secrets and mythic landscapes unfold before us. From the frost-covered mountains of Midgard to the golden halls of Asgard, these tales of gods and giants will carry you into peaceful slumber. Lay down your weapons, rest your weary head, and allow the legends of these powerful beings to become the landscape of your dreams. The battles have been fought, and now is the time for rest. So close your eyes, brave one. Let the fire of the hearth warm you as we begin our journey through realms both wondrous and dangerous. The winds of Midgard carried the scent of salt and frost as Kratos stood motionless atop the weathered cliff. Far below, waves crashed against jagged rocks with a rhythmic violence that echoed the turmoil within his own chest. He had climbed here alone, leaving Atreus asleep in their makeshift camp beneath the shelter of ancient pines. The boy needed rest before what lay ahead. So did Kratos. But rest had always been elusive for the ghost of Sparta. The fading daylight painted the vast northern sea in shades of amber and deep blue, colors that reminded him of distant shores and battles long past. This realm, so different from the sun-baked lands of his birth, had become a place of unexpected revelation. Here, among forests thick with secrets and mountains that seemed to touch the very roof of the world, Kratos had found something he had long believed lost forever, a purpose beyond vengeance, a path beyond destruction. His calloused fingers traced the faded markings on his skin, red against ashen grey, a permanent testament to choices made and consequences borne. The chains had long since been removed from his flesh, yet in moments of stillness like this, he could still feel their phantom weight. Freedom, he had learned, was not the absence of chains, but the strength to carry their memory without being bound by it. Storm clouds gathered on the distant horizon, dark and heavy with promise. They would reach this shore by morning, perhaps sooner. Time was a luxury they could no longer afford, yet Kratos found himself seeking this moment of solitude, this breath between decisions that could not be unmade. The approaching tempest mirrored the conflict awaiting them beyond, powerful, inevitable, and potentially transformative. Storms cleared away what was weak, revealed what had been hidden, forced change upon landscapes that had remained unaltered for ages. Quite the view from up here, Mimir observed, his voice subdued as if respecting the gravity of Kratos' thoughts. The severed head hung from Kratos' belt, positioned to observe the same sweeping vista. Though, I suspect you didn't climb all this way merely to admire the scenery. The ancient sage's presence was both intrusion and comfort, an odd companion for one who had spent centuries preferring solitude. Yet Mimir's wisdom had proven valuable enough to tolerate his incessant commentary, and, in rare moments, Kratos found himself appreciating the perspective of one who had witnessed even more of history's brutal cycles than he had. Kratos did not immediately respond. His amber eyes remained fixed on the boundary where turbulent sea met darkening sky. The wind tugged at his beard and the edges of his fur-lined cloak, but he stood unmoved, like the mountain itself given form. In the distance, a flock of birds wheeled and turned in unison, black silhouettes against the threatening sky, instinctively fleeing the approaching storm, seeking shelter while escape remained possible. Contemplation before battle is a warrior's right, he finally said, his deep voice barely audible above the wind, and a father's duty. Ah. Mimir replied knowingly. Thinking of the boy, then. Can't say I blame you. What awaits beyond those clouds is no small undertaking, even for a god. A god. The word still sat uneasily with Kratos, though he could no longer deny its truth. The blood of Olympus flowed in his veins, passed now to his son through a lineage he had once sought to escape. Divinity had brought him nothing but suffering, had transformed him into both victim and monster, a weapon wielded by forces he had not fully understood until it was too late. He had hoped to spare Atreus such knowledge, such burden. That hope, like so many before it, had proven futile. Kratos shifted his gaze downward to where the ocean churned against stone far below. The relentless assault of water against rock reminded him of his own existence. Constant resistance, erosion over time, yet the core remained. Changed perhaps, but never truly broken. How many forces had sought to break him? Gods and titans, fate and fury, his own unquenchable rage. All had tried and ultimately failed. He remained, scarred but standing, bearing witness to the fall of those who had believed themselves his betters. The ocean spray rose in misty clouds where waves met cliff, creating momentary rainbows when caught by the last rays of the setting sun. Beauty born of collision, of opposing forces meeting in violent harmony. Perhaps there was wisdom in that, a lesson he was only now beginning to comprehend. Strength, he muttered, more to himself than to Mimir. What does it truly mean? Now there's a question worthy of the greatest philosophers, Mimir responded with genuine interest. Though I suspect a man who has carried the weight of gods and titans on his shoulders might have insights even the wisest sages lack. Kratos had never considered himself a philosopher. In Sparta, thinking was valued only insofar as it served action, strategy that led to victory, discipline that forged warriors, cunning that defeated enemies. Contemplation for its own sake was seen as indulgence, weakness. Yet here, on this precipice between worlds, with responsibilities that transcended mere survival or conquest, he found himself drawn to questions that had no simple answers, wrestling with concepts that could not be subdued by blade or fist. The sky darkened further as twilight descended upon the realm. Stars began to appear between breaks in the clouds, pinpricks of light in the growing darkness. Kratos found his thoughts drifting to Sparta, to lessons learned beneath a merciless sun, and the unforgiving instruction of men who shaped boys into weapons for wars that never truly ended. They had taught him to fight, to kill, to conquer. They had not taught him to live, to love, to build rather than destroy. Those lessons had come later, at far greater cost. In Sparta, Kratos began, his tone shifting as memories surfaced. Strength was measured by what one could endure, by how much pain could be inflicted upon enemies. He closed his eyes briefly, seeing again the training grounds where boys fought until blood soaked the dust, where weakness was beaten out and hardness hammered in, where he had excelled, rising above his peers through a combination of natural gift and relentless determination, never suspecting the price such excellence would one day demand, by how much death one could deliver. The wind carried the salt tang of the sea, so different from the dry heat of Greece, yet somehow triggering memories just as vivid, of battles fought under banners now forgotten, of men who had followed him into glory and doom alike, of oaths sworn and broken in the pursuit of victory at any cost. The young Spartan captain he had been would not recognize the figure he had become, scarred, solitary, seeking penance rather than conquest. A rather limited perspective, Mimir offered gently. Yes. The admission came without hesitation, surprising even Kratos himself. Time had granted him perspective that rage had once blinded. It was insufficient. Insufficient to prepare him for the machinations of gods. Insufficient to protect his family when divine vengeance sought him out. Insufficient to prevent his transformation into the very monster he had once sworn to defeat. The strength of Sparta had made him a weapon, but had not taught him when to strike and when to stay his hand, when to advance and when to retreat, when to trust and when to doubt. A gust of wind swept across the cliff, carrying with it the distant cry of a hunting falcon. Kratos tracked its flight, a dark silhouette against the deepening blue sky. The bird's wings spread wide, riding currents invisible to the eye yet undeniably present. Like fate itself, unseen but felt, shaping the path ahead. He had once believed himself bound to a destiny of destruction, trapped in a cycle of violence from which there could be no escape. Fae had shown him otherwise, and now their son represented possibility he had never dared imagine, a legacy beyond bloodshed, a future not determined by the failures of the past. "Father!" Atreus's voice drifted up from the path below, soft yet clear in the evening air. "Is everything all right?" The sound pulled Kratos from his reverie, anchoring him once more in the present moment. There was something in the boy's voice that always managed to pierce through the fog of memory and regret that sometimes threatened to envelop him. A clarity, a purpose that reminded him of responsibilities that transcended his own troubled past. Kratos turned slightly, watching as his son navigated the rocky trail with practiced ease. The boy had grown stronger in both body and spirit since their journey began. Each challenge faced, each truth revealed had shaped him, just as the waves below shaped the stone through persistent force. Gone was the frail child who had struggled to draw a bowstring. In his place stood a young warrior beginning to understand his own considerable power, for better or worse. Where once Atreus had stumbled on such terrain, now he moved with the sure-footed confidence of one born to the wilds. His steps were deliberate, his balance perfect, even as loose stones shifted beneath his feet. Faye's training showed in every movement, the subtle awareness of environment, the economy of motion, the respect for the land that supported him. These were gifts beyond price, lessons that would serve the boy long after physical strength began to fail. "Yes," Kratos replied, his voice softening imperceptibly. "The camp is secure." Atreus reached the summit, slightly breathless from the climb but standing tall beside his father. The wind immediately caught at his fur cloak, making it billow behind him like wings. For an instant, Kratos saw not just the boy who stood before him, but glimpses of the man he might become, strong yet compassionate, powerful yet wise, carrying the legacy of both parents while forging his own distinct path. "Everything's fine, I just woke up and you were gone." The unspoken concern hung between them, a testament to losses both had endured. Fear of abandonment lingered in the boy despite all reassurances, just as wariness of attachment haunted the father despite all evidence of its necessity. The last rays of sunlight caught in Atreus's hair, turning it to burnished gold against the darkening sky. His eyes, so like his mother's in both color and perception, held questions he was still learning to articulate. Kratos recognized the expression, the gathering of courage required to broach subjects that might trigger his father's legendary reticence. "I needed to see what lies ahead," Kratos explained, gesturing toward the gathering storm. To prepare. The boy nodded, his gaze following his father's toward the horizon. It looks big. The storm, I mean. It is, Kratos confirmed. No attempt to shield the truth. He had learned that lesson through bitter experience, that protecting Atreus meant preparing him, not sheltering him from reality's harshness. A comfortable silence fell between them, father and son united in contemplation of the brewing tempest. There had been a time, not so long ago, when such moments would have been filled with tension. Kratos unable to express the thoughts that troubled him. Atreus afraid to ask the questions that consumed him. Now they could stand together in shared quiet, each respecting the other's process, neither demanding what could not yet be given. The approaching storm painted the clouds in deepening shades of purple and grey, occasionally illuminated from within by distant lightning that had not yet found voice. Nature's power gathering, building toward inevitable release. Kratos had witnessed similar patterns in battle, the quiet tension before the clash of armies, the held breath before steel met flesh and blood-soaked earth. There was beauty in such moments, terrible and profound, when potential energy gathered before transformation into kinetic force. They stood together in silence, father and son atop the world, watching as darkness claimed the sky and stars multiplied in their thousands. The wind continued its mournful song around them, weaving through ancient stone formations shaped by centuries of similar gales. Overhead, stars emerged in constellations both familiar and foreign to Kratos' eye. Patterns that had guided sailors and warriors in his homeland, replaced by northern configurations, with names and stories he was only beginning to learn. The Great Bear wheeled slowly around the fixed star, marking time's passage with celestial precision. The same stars had watched over his birth in Sparta, had witnessed his rise and fall in Greece, had guided his journey north to these frozen lands. They would continue their eternal dance, long after he had returned to dust. There was comfort in that continuity, that perspective which rendered even gods temporary against the canvas of cosmic time. You know, Mimir interjected thoughtfully, his voice breaking the extended silence. There's an old tale about storms in these parts. The Jotnar believed great storms were actually the breath of sleeping giants, their dreams spilling into our realm as wind and thunder. Atreus' eyes widened with interest, the natural curiosity that sometimes worried Kratos, yet also filled him with peculiar pride. The boy's hunger for knowledge, for stories, for understanding of the world around him was insatiable. A trait inherited from his mother, who had collected tales and wisdom like others gathered material treasures. Really, mother never told me that one. Well, she might have had her reasons. Mimir continued, his wooden features somehow conveying thoughtfulness despite their limited mobility. Some stories are saved for when they're most needed. The Jotar were particularly selective about which traditions they shared and when, believing that knowledge, like all things, has its proper season. Kratos considered this. Faye had indeed been selective in what she taught their son, revealing some skills immediately while withholding others until specific moments. Her foresight, which had once frustrated him as unnecessary secrecy, now revealed itself as careful preparation, planting seeds that would grow when conditions proved right, laying foundations for revelations the boy would need to face what lay ahead. Dimi said, the largest storms came from the deepest dreaming, Mimir elaborated, clearly enjoying having an attentive audience in Atreus. That giants who had slumbered for millennia occasionally stirred in their sleep, causing tempests that could reshape coastlines and flatten forests. After such storms, The ancient Northmen would search for footprints or other signs of giant passage, believing momentary breaches between sleeping and waking realms might have occurred. The wind gusted stronger, as if responding to Mimir's tale, carrying with it the first hints of rain, scattered drops that struck exposed skin with cold precision. The storm was advancing faster than it had first appeared, the boundary between preparation and experience narrowing with each passing moment. Rather like strength itself, wouldn't you say, brother? This last question was directed at Kratos, a gentle prompt to continue the interrupted contemplation. The head's perception was keen, recognizing the rare moment when the typically taciturn warrior might be willing to share insights normally kept firmly guarded. There was wisdom in seizing such opportunities when they presented themselves. Kratos studied his son's face in the fading light. The curiosity, the intelligence, the determination that reminded him so much of Faye. What legacy was he leaving this child? What measure of strength was he teaching him? The boy watched him expectantly, hungry for whatever wisdom his father might impart, treasuring these rare moments of verbal connection like precious artifacts from a hidden realm. There are many kinds of strength, Kratos began, the words coming with unusual deliberation. The strength to destroy is easiest to recognize, to break what stands before you. His hand unconsciously moved to rest on the handle of his axe, feeling the familiar weight. I excelled at this kind. Atreus listened intently, sensing the rarity of such openness from his father. But there is strength in building, Kratos continued, in healing what is broken, in restraint when rage burns hottest. His gaze returned to the horizon, where lightning now flickered distantly within the storm clouds. In these, I was deficient. You're better now, Adrius offered quietly. You're learning. The simple observation struck Kratos with unexpected force. Learning. Even now, after centuries of existence, countless battles and the fall of gods at his hands, he was still learning. Perhaps that was its own kind of strength. The capacity to change, to grow beyond what fate and circumstance had intended. Yes, he acknowledged, placing a hand briefly on his son's shoulder. We both are. Below them, the sea's fury intensified as the approaching storm stirred deeper currents. Waves crashed with greater force against the cliff face, sending spray high enough that occasional droplets reached them even at this elevation. The taste of salt mingled with the scent of pine and earth, Midgard's elements converging around them. Do you remember what you told me about my bow? Atreus asked suddenly. During my first hunt, Kratos searched his memory. I told you many things. You said a weapon is only as good as the one who wields it, Atreus recalled. That it's an extension of yourself. Yes, I've been thinking about that, the boy continued, his voice gaining confidence. Maybe strength is like that too. It changes depending on who has it and how they use it. Mimir chuckled appreciatively. By the gods, the lad has wisdom beyond his years. Couldn't have put it better myself. Kratos studied his son with newfound appreciation. The observation was astute, perhaps more insightful than Atreus himself realized. Strength, like any power, was neither inherently virtuous nor corrupt. Its nature was determined by its wielder's intent, by the heart that directed its application. Your mother would be proud of that thought, Kratos said quietly. Atreus' eyes widened slightly at the rare compliment, then softened with the mention of Faye. Do you think she would be proud of us? Of what we're doing? The question lingered in the wind-swept silence. Kratos considered what lay before them, the confrontation that could not be avoided, the forces they would challenge, the truths they still sought. Faye had set them on this path with her final wish, but the journey had become far more complex than either had anticipated. Yes, he answered finally. She knew what she asked of us, what it would demand. His voice grew firmer. She would not have chosen this path if she did not believe we could walk it. The conviction in his tone seemed to reassure Atreus, whose shoulders relaxed slightly. The boy moved closer to the cliff's edge, peering down at the turbulent waters below with the fearlessness of youth. Kratos resisted the urge to pull him back, recognizing another lesson in strength, knowing when to protect and when to trust. The Spartans, Kratos found himself saying, believed that fear was weakness, that to acknowledge doubt was to invite defeat. He joined his son at the edge, feeling the spray of distant waves on his face. They were wrong. Atreus looked up in surprise. It was rare for his father to speak of Sparta, rarer still to hear him contradict its teachings. True courage is not the absence of fear, Kratos continued, meeting his son's gaze. It is action despite fear, perseverance despite doubt. His voice deepened. Even the strongest warrior knows fear. The difference lies in what follows. I am afraid, Atreus admitted, his voice small but steady, of what's coming, of what we might find. He gestured toward the storm on the horizon, of what might happen to us. Kratos nodded, neither dismissing the fear nor amplifying it. As am I. The simple acknowledgement hung between them, profound in its honesty. A god of war admitting fear not as weakness but as wisdom, recognition of what was at stake, of what could be lost. Well, this is quite the moment, Mimir observed softly. If I still had a body, I suspect I'd be feeling a chill down my spine that has nothing to do with the wind. Lightning flashed again, closer now, briefly illuminating the three figures on the cliff in stark relief. The towering warrior with his weathered face, the young boy with determination beyond his years, and the severed head that still carried ancient wisdom in its wooden features. An unlikely family, forged through shared trials rather than blood alone. When I was a boy, Mimir said into the comfortable silence that followed, my father told me that storms were opportunities for the brave. While others seek shelter, he would say, the wise find advantage in chaos. Your father sounds like a Spartan, Kratos. Hardly, Mimir laughed. He was a scholar, actually. Terrible with a sword, but brilliant with words. What he meant was that disruption reveals what might otherwise remain hidden. Storms strip away pretense. Atreus seemed to consider this. Like how rain washes away tracks and makes new ones visible. Precisely, lad. The coming conflict will reveal truths about gods and men alike. About ourselves as well, I'd wager. Thunder rumbled in the distance. A deep bass note that seemed to resonate within Kratos' chest. The storm was drawing closer, perhaps only hours away now. Soon they would need to descend, to prepare their weapons and equipment, to steel themselves for what must be faced. But for now, this moment of reflection held its own value. A different kind of preparation, equally vital to what lay ahead. Kratos found his thoughts turning to the many battlefields he had known. From the sun-baked hills of Greece to the snow-covered forests of Midgard, he had fought and killed and survived. But it was not the victories he recalled now, not the enemies fallen before his blades, or the glory earned in combat. Instead, he remembered the quiet moments between, the breath before the charge, the stillness after the slaughter, the weight of decisions that could not be unmade. I believe, he said slowly, each word deliberate, that strength lies in balance, between force and restraint, between action and reflection. His gaze moved from the approaching storm to his son's attentive face, between what we were born to be and what we choose to become. Atreus nodded, absorbing the lesson with characteristic thoughtfulness. Like you chose to be more than just the ghost of Sparta. Like you chose to be... He hesitated. To be my father. The words struck Kratos with unexpected force. Yes, he had sired the boy, but truly being a father, that had been a choice made daily, often imperfectly, sometimes reluctantly, but ultimately with growing conviction. It was perhaps the most difficult battle he had ever fought, not against gods or monsters, but against his own nature, his own past, his own fear of failing this child as he had failed others before. Yes, he acknowledged, the single syllable heavy with meaning. A comfortable silence settled between them as the last light faded from the western sky. Stars burned more brightly now, ancient constellations that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of gods, the struggles of mortals and immortals alike. Kratos identified patterns he had known since childhood. Warriors and beasts immortalized in the heavens, their stories preserved in points of light. The stars are different here than in Greece, he observed, surprising himself with the comparison. Memories of his homeland came rarely, and seldom, without pain. Really? Atreus looked up with interest. How so? Kratos pointed toward a bright cluster of stars. In Sparta, we called those the shield of Hercules. Here they are the eye of Tyr. Same stars, different stories, Mimir noted. Rather like people themselves, wouldn't you say? Depending on who's looking and what they're searching for. Atreus studied the formation with new appreciation. I like that the same thing can have different meanings depending on where you stand. Indeed, Mimir agreed. Perspective shapes reality more often than many would admit. Your father was both demon and hero in Greece, depending on who told the tale. Kratos tensed slightly at the observation, but did not contradict it. Both were true in their way. Destroyer and deliverer, villain and victim, weapon and wounded. He had been many things, worn many titles, earned many names. The ghost of Sparta, the god of war, the slayer of gods, father. This last title, the simplest and newest, somehow carried more weight than all others combined. Lightning split the sky again, closer now, momentarily turning night to day with its brilliant flash. Thunder followed almost immediately, a deafening crack that seemed to shake the very cliff beneath their feet. The storm was approaching, faster than anticipated. We should return to camp, Kratos decided, noting how the wind had strengthened, driving occasional raindrops before it like scouts preceding an army. Secure our equipment before the full storm arrives. Atreus nodded, though he seemed reluctant to leave this moment behind. Father, he said as they turned from the cliff edge, thank you for talking to me about strength and everything. Kratos paused, finding words where once there would have been only awkward silence. You have earned the right to understand, not just to follow orders, but to know why they are given. The boy straightened with pride at this acknowledgement of his growth. Together they began the descent, navigating the steep path with practiced caution. The wind whipped around them more fiercely now, carrying the distinct scent of rain and electricity. Despite the deteriorating conditions, Kratos found his mind clearer than it had been in many days, as if the approaching storm had somehow organized his thoughts rather than scattered them. I've been pondering what you said earlier, brother. Mimir spoke as they carefully traversed a particularly narrow section of trail, about the different kinds of strength. There's one you didn't mention that bears consideration. What kind is that? Atreus asked, his natural curiosity undiminished by the worsening weather. The strength to begin again, Mimir replied. To lose everything, to face complete devastation, and still find reason to continue. To build anew, rather than surrender to despair. His wooden eyes seemed to fix meaningfully on Kratos. It may be the rarest strength of all. Kratos met the gaze briefly, recognizing the truth in the observation. How many times had he lost everything? How many times had he stood amid the ashes of his former life, covered in blood, both others and his own, with nothing remaining but the hollow victory of survival? And yet each time he had continued, not always well, not always wisely, but he had refused the final surrender. And now here he was, guiding his son down a mountain path in a realm far from his birth, preparing to face yet another battle that was both necessary and unwelcome. Beginning again. The strongest steel, Kratos said quietly, is forged in the hottest fire and quenched in the coldest water. Extremes shape it. He placed a steadying hand on Atreus' shoulder as the boy navigated a slippery section of rock. But too many such treatments make it brittle. That's why the best blades are tempered, Athrys added, drawing on knowledge Brock and Sindri had shared. Heated again, but not as hot. Cooled slowly, not quenched. It balances the hardness with flexibility. Yes, Cracklin confirmed, pleased with his son's understanding. Balance in all things. They continued downward as the first substantial raindrops began to fall. Fat, heavy drops that struck the ground with audible impacts. The storm's advance guard had arrived, and the main force would not be far behind. By the time they reached the forest's edge, the rain had increased to a steady percussion against leaves and earth alike. Their camp lay just ahead, the small fire they had left now reduced to glowing embers under the assault of increasing rainfall. The shelter Tracy had constructed earlier, a clever arrangement of pine boughs and oilcloth, remained intact, offering protection for their essential gear and sleeping furs. Despite the worsening conditions, there was something comforting about returning to this humble space they had created together. We should add support to the windward side, Kratos observed, already moving toward a fallen branch that would serve their purpose. The full storm will test its strength. Together, they reinforced the shelter, working efficiently with the unspoken coordination that had developed between them over months of travel. Atreus anticipated his father's needs, passing supplies before they were requested, suggesting improvements that Kratos acknowledged with nods of approval. The boy's ingenuity complemented the warrior's experience, creating solutions neither might have devised alone. A fine fortress against the elements, Mimir commented as they completed their work. Reminds me of shelters the ancient Northmen would build during their seasonal hunts. Simple, but remarkably effective. Lightning flashed overhead, thunder following with barely a breath between. The storm was directly above them now. Rain fell in sheets, transforming the forest floor into a network of tiny streams and pools. Within their reinforced shelter, however, they remained relatively dry, the carefully angled roof channeling water away from their sleeping area and supplies. Kratos added wood to the struggling fire, positioning larger pieces to shield the smaller kindling until it caught again. Soon a modest flame pushed back against the surrounding darkness, casting dancing shadows across their shelter's interior. The constant drumming of rain created a rhythmic backdrop that was oddly soothing despite its intensity. "Should we try to sleep now?" Atreus asked, arranging his furs near enough to the fire for warmth without risking stray sparks. Kratos considered the question. Rest would be wise before what awaited them, yet he sensed the boy had more on his mind, questions held back during their time on the cliff, but still seeking answers. "Soon," he replied. "But first, tell me what troubles your thoughts." Atreus looked surprised at the invitation, then grateful. He settled more comfortably, cross-legged on his sleeping furs, the firelight illuminating his features. For a moment, Kratos was struck by how much older the boy appeared compared when their journey began, not just in physical growth, but in the wisdom that now tempered his expressions, the patience that balanced his natural enthusiasm. "I've been thinking about tomorrow," Atreus began carefully, "about what we might face." He traced patterns in the dirt floor absently with one finger. "The gods we've met so far, they weren't what I expected. They were disappointing," Kratos finished for him. "Yes." Atreus looked up, relieved at the understanding. Balder, Thor, even Freya in her own way. They're also angry, selfish. His brow furrowed. "Is that what being a god means? Being powerful but broken inside?" The question hung in the air, weighty with implications that stretched beyond tomorrow's confrontation to encompass Atreus's own developing identity. Kratos felt the familiar urge to deflect, to offer simple reassurance or stern distraction. But the boy deserved better, deserved truth, however difficult. "Gods," Kratos began slowly, choosing each word with care, "are not defined by virtue or wisdom. Power alone makes one a god, the ability to shape reality through will and strength." His expression darkened slightly. "What that power reveals is what already exists within, like a magnifying glass," Atreus suggested. "Making everything bigger, good or bad." "Yes," Kratos nodded, appreciating the analogy. "A mortal man's flaws may harm a family, a village. A god's flaws devastate nations, realms." He stared into the fire, memories of his own devastation flickering in its depths. "I have learned this at great cost." Thunder crashed overhead, punctuating his words with cosmic emphasis. Rain continued its relentless assault against their shelter, but it held firm. A small triumph of preparation against nature's raw power. "But it doesn't have to be that way, does it?" Atreus pressed, his voice gaining strength. "Being a god doesn't mean you have to be cruel or selfish. It's still a choice." Mimir, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, now spoke from where Kratos had carefully placed him near the fire's warmth. "The lad's right, you know. History has known gods of healing as well as harm, of creation as well as destruction." His wooden features seemed to soften in the firelight. "Rare as diamonds, mind you, but they existed. Kratos considered this. Throughout his blood-soaked history, he had encountered gods of every conceivable domain and disposition. Most had been corrupt, arrogant, indifferent to suffering they did not themselves experience. But there had been exceptions. Beings of power who wielded it with restraint, with purpose beyond self-interest. Few had survived the capricious politics of divine realms, but they had existed. It is possible, he conceded, but difficult. Power bends the mind toward its own preservation and expansion. It requires constant vigilance against corruption. His eyes locked with his son's. Constant choice against one's baser nature. Atreus absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. Like you choosing not to kill people who haven't wronged us. Like you teaching me to hunt only what we need. Yes. Kratos was surprised by the examples. Small moments he had not realized carried such significance for the boy. Small choices build upon each other. They form a path. A path to what? Adri asked. Kratos found himself without an immediate answer. What was the destination of this path they walked together? What final form would their journey take? Once, his goals had been simple. Survival, vengeance, escape from the consequences of his actions. Now, with this child before him, everything had become more complex, more consequential. To something better, he finally answered, than what came before. Lightning illuminated their shelter briefly, casting their shadows against the rear wall, one massive, one small, yet somehow equally substantial in their solidity. In that flash, Kratos saw something he had missed before. That Atreus was not merely following him, but standing beside him, not just receiving wisdom, but contributing his own. The path they walked was being formed by both of them, step by step, choice by choice. That's enough, Mimir observed quietly. Isn't it? To strive for something better, even without certainty of success? Kratos considered the question seriously. Was it enough? After centuries of bloodshed, of gods toppled and civilizations altered through his actions, was it sufficient to simply aim for improvement rather than perfection? To acknowledge the flaws within himself, yet continue forward anyway? It must be, he answered finally, for it is all we have. The storm continued its assault, yet within their humble shelter, a different kind of weather seemed to be clearing. The tension that had gathered around tomorrow's confrontation remained, but it had been contextualized, placed within a larger framework that made it manageable, if not diminished. We should rest now, Kratos decided, seeing fatigue beginning to show in his son's posture, despite the boy's attempts to hide it. Tomorrow will demand our full strength. Atreus nodded, arranging himself in his sleeping furs with practiced efficiency. The constant sound of rainfall created a soothing backdrop that would make sleep easier despite the occasional crash of thunder. Before settling completely, however, he asked one final question. Father, what do you think happens after all this? After the storm passes. Kratos paused. Understanding the question went beyond tomorrow's weather, to encompass all that awaited them. Battles, revelations, choices that could not be undone. It was not something he had allowed himself to consider often, focusing instead on the immediacy of survival and the next necessary action. I do not know, he admitted, but we will face it together. The simple promise seemed to satisfy Atreus, who nodded and finally surrendered to sleep's approach. Within minutes, his breathing had settled into the deep, regular rhythm of youth's unburdened rest. Kratos remained awake longer, adding occasional wood to the fire, listening to the storm's fury gradually diminishing as it moved eastward across the realm. The thunder grew more distant, the lightning less frequent, though rain continued its steady fall, cleansing, renewing, transforming the world outside their shelter. In the fire's dying light, he studied his sleeping son's face, features relaxed in unconsciousness, all curiosity and concern temporarily set aside. So much rested on those young shoulders, so much potential for both greatness and suffering. The responsibility of guiding such a child weighed heavily, yet Kratos found himself increasingly grateful for its burden. "He is remarkable, isn't he?" Mimir observed softly, his voice barely audible above the rain. "A perfect balance of both his parents. Your strength, her wisdom, and something entirely his own besides." Kratos did not disagree. "He sees what could be," he said after a long pause, "where I have seen only what is." "The gift of youth," Mimir suggested, unburdened by experience's weight. Perhaps. Kratos considered this, or perhaps simply a better heart than mine. Mimir's wooden features arranged themselves in what might have been a smile. "You're too hard on yourself, brother. That heart of yours has changed more than you admit, even to yourself." Kratos did not respond directly, but he did not reject the observation either. Instead, he settled himself near his son, assuming the position of rest, while maintaining the awareness that had kept him alive through countless nights in hostile territory. As sleep approached, his thoughts returned to their conversation on the cliff. About strength, about choice, about the path ahead. The storm would pass, as all storms do. What remained would be determined not by prophecy or divine decree, but by the choices made in its aftermath. By a father and son walking the boundary between human and divine, between past sins and future possibilities, between what they were born to be and what they might become. In the distance, thunder rumbled one final time. Not a threat, but a reminder. A promise of power that could destroy or renew depending on how it was met. Kratos welcomed the sound as he surrendered to sleep, finding in it not an enemy, but a companion, in the quiet contemplation of strength's true nature. Outside their shelter, the rain continued its gentle fall upon Midgard's ancient earth, preparing the ground for whatever would grow when morning came. If you enjoyed the quiet before the storm, join us next time for The Weight of the Past, where we follow Kratos as he confronts memories of his former life, while teaching Atreus valuable lessons about carrying the burden of history. The cold northern wind whispered through the narrow opening of the cave, carrying with it the distant echoes of battle that punctuated the otherwise silent night. Kratos sat motionless before the small fire he had built, his massive frame cast in dancing orange light that threw his shadow against the rough stone walls. The flames reflected in his eyes as they stared, unblinking, into the heart of the blade. Outside, the moon hung low and heavy, partially obscured by clouds that promised snow before dawn. Inside, protected from the elements but not from his thoughts, the ghost of Sparta prepared for what was to come. Beside him lay the Leviathan axe, its enchanted metal gleaming coldly in the firelight. On his other side, placed carefully on a flat stone, rested the blades of chaos. Weapons he had once thought buried with his past, now unearthed by necessity. His fingers worked methodically, almost unconsciously, As he sharpened the curved edge of one blade with a whetstone worn smooth from years of use, the rhythmic scraping sound filled the small space, punctuated only by the occasional crack of burning wood and the soft howl of wind finding new paths through the mountain. The motion was meditative, back and forth, allowing his mind an anchor in physical reality as his thoughts drifted through realms of memory. Each pass of the stone against metal revealed a slightly cleaner edge, the accumulated damage from countless battles gradually giving way to renewed lethality. There was comfort in this simple process, this tangible transformation, from worn to renewed, damaged to restored. If only flesh and spirit could be repaired with such straightforward effort, such reliable results. But the scars that truly mattered were not so easily addressed, the edges of the soul not so readily resharpened. The blade of chaos grew warm in his hand as he worked, not from friction alone, but from something intrinsic to the weapon itself, as if it anticipated the battle to come, hungered for it in a way that resonated with some primal part of his own nature. Even after all this time, after all the blood they had spilled together, the connection between warrior and weapon remained unnervingly intimate. They had been forged in the same fires of rage and purpose, had been tempered in the same rivers of consequential bloodshed. When Ares had bound these blades to him, the pain had been excruciating. Physical agony, as the chains burned through flesh to bone. Magical torment, as the weapon's essence merged with his own. But that initial suffering had paled compared to what followed. The years of servitude, the atrocities committed in the god of war's name, and finally, the ultimate horror of awakening from bloodlust, to find his wife and child dead by his own hand, their blood still wet on the very blades he now maintained. The whetstone paused momentarily as the memory surfaced, still razor-sharp despite the centuries that had passed. Some wounds never truly healed, some burdens never lightened with time's passage. He had carried the ashes of his first family bound to his skin, a self-imposed penance that had transformed him physically, the pale ash contrasting starkly with his natural olive complexion, earning him the title that still followed him, the Ghost of Sparta, a fitting name for a man caught between life and death, between mortal and divine, between past that could not be escaped and future that remained uncertainly formed. Kratos had chosen this cave carefully, high enough to provide a clear view of the valleys below where forces gathered, yet concealed enough to offer temporary sanctuary, a place to prepare, to rest, and, though he would not have admitted it aloud, to think. The battle would come with the dawn, inevitable as the tide. This brief solitude was not a luxury, but a necessity. A warrior sharpens more than his blade before combat. The whetstone paused in its motion as Kratos tilted the blade of chaos, examining its edge in the firelight. The weapon seemed to pulse with a dull reddish glow that had nothing to do with the fire's reflection. An inner heat that never fully cooled, a rage that never completely subsided. His thumb traced the edge, testing its sharpness. Satisfied, he set it down and reached for its twin, beginning the same methodical process once more. As his hands continued their practiced routine, Khrushchev's mind drifted, not to the coming battle, but backward, to earlier wars, earlier lives. The memories came not as a gentle tide, but as they always did, like a breach in a dam, sudden and overwhelming. He did not fight them tonight. Instead, he let them wash over him, knowing that sometimes, to move forward, one must first look back. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks upward, and in their brief, brilliant flight, Kratos saw the torches of Sparta. He saw himself as a boy, small but already fierce, standing in the training grounds of his homeland. The Spartan instructors moved among the young warriors, their voices harsh, their expectations merciless. The sun beat down on them without mercy, the dust rising in clouds around their feet as they practiced the movements that would one day save their lives or end their enemies. A Spartan never lets his back hit the ground, they would say. Spartan never surrenders. These were not merely instructions, but commandments, the foundation upon which their entire society was built. The dry dust of the training yard filled his nostrils, mixed with a metallic scent of blood from split lips and broken noses, the smaller wounds that prepared boys for the greater ones to come. Pain was not the enemy, but the teacher, and Kratos had been an apt pupil. Even then, something in him had burned hotter than in the other boys, a driving force that pushed him beyond normal limits, that turned his failures into fuel rather than defeat. He remembered one day in particular, when he had faced an older, larger opponent in the wrestling circle. The other boy had thrown him 3 times in succession, each impact driving the air from his lungs, each defeat drawing jeers from some of the onlookers. On the 4th attempt, something had shifted within the young Kratos, not just determination, but a spark of the rage that would later define him. He had moved differently, had found strength beyond what his young body should have contained. The older boy had gone down hard, the crack of his arm breaking audible across the training yard. The instructors had not punished him for the excessive force. Instead, they had watched him more closely afterward, had pushed him harder, sensing something valuable in his capacity for controlled violence. The uncontrolled blade cuts its wielder first, one had told him, his scarred face impassive. Learn to direct your anger, boy, or it will direct you. A lesson he had understood in principle, but had taken centuries to truly learn in practice. Again, the instructor would say, after Kratos had been knocked down for the 5th time, his young body aching, his pride burning hotter than any physical pain. And he would rise, again and again, until he was the one leaving others in the dust, until even the older boys avoided his gaze, stepped carefully around him in the meal hall, recognized something in him that went beyond ordinary ambition or skill. The memory shifted, blurring like sand redistributed by wind, reforming into later years. Now he stood taller, broader, a man grown and battle-hardened. The copper smell of blood was stronger here, mingled with the scent of burning wood and cooking fires. The walls of Troy loomed in the distance, silhouetted against the setting sun, their imposing height a challenge that had resisted Greek efforts for nearly a decade. Around him, Spartan warriors prepared for the coming day's fighting, sharpening weapons, repairing armor, sharing stories in low voices that never quite disguised the underlying tension before battle. He could almost feel the weight of his Spartan armor, so different from what he wore now, yet the burden was familiar. The responsibility of command had rested heavily on his shoulders, each decision carrying the weight of lives, each victory marked not just by glory, but by the cost paid in blood. The whetstone moved steadily across the blade's edge, matching the rhythm of marching feet in his memory, the disciplined cadence of Spartan phalanxes moving as one entity, spears forward, shields locked. An unstoppable human fortress advancing across battlefields from Greece to Persia and beyond. He had led them to glory after glory, his reputation growing with each campaign until even the gods took notice. The gods. The whetstone paused momentarily before resuming its work. How young he had been then, how proud, and how blind. When Ares had appeared to him in that desperate moment, offering power in exchange for service, it had seemed like salvation. The chains that bound the blades of chaos to his forearms had burned through flesh to bone, a physical pain that paled compared to what would follow. The cave seemed to grow darker despite the steady fire, the shadows deepening as his thoughts turned to the darkest chapter of his past. He could still hear their screams sometimes, in dreams he could never outrun. His wife, his daughter, fallen by his own hand in a temple he had been tricked into attacking during his bloodlust. The horror of that moment had never diminished, never scarred over. It remained an open wound that time had not healed. The rage that followed had been all-consuming, a fury directed first at Ares for his deception, then at all the gods of Olympus for their manipulation and indifference, and finally, perhaps most destructively, at himself. Vengeance had become his sole purpose, his only reason to continue drawing breath in a world suddenly stripped of all other meaning. Kratos set the second blade down, now home to lethal perfection. He reached for a cloth and began to methodically clean each weapon, removing the fine metal dust left by the whetstone. His movements remained steady, but his breathing had grown slightly heavier as the memories continued their relentless advance. He remembered the fall of Ares, the moment when the god of war had realized too late that he had created his own destruction in his chosen champion. The satisfaction Kratos had expected to feel at his revenge had been hollow, fleeting. He had become the new god of war then, ascending to Olympus, but godhood had proven to be just another form of chains. The gods had feared him, had sought to control him, and when that failed, to destroy him. Their fear had been justified. His war against Olympus had been cataclysmic, each god falling before his unstoppable rage, until Zeus himself, father of gods and men, had fallen by his hand. Mountains had crumbled, the sea had risen to claim the land, and darkness had covered the sun as the natural order collapsed with the death of those who maintained it. He had been prepared to die then, his vengeance complete, his purpose fulfilled. He had driven the blade of Olympus into his own body, releasing the power of hope to a devastated world. But death, it seemed, had not wanted him. Outside the cave, the wind changed direction, bringing with it the scent of pine and snow. Kratos inhaled deeply, letting the present moment anchor him before the past could pull him under completely. He reached for the Leviathan axe next, though it required less maintenance than the blades. The dwarven craftsmanship had ensured its edge remained preternaturally sharp, its enchantments intact despite the battles it had seen. Still, the routine offered focus, purpose. As his fingers traced the intricate runes etched into the axe's surface, his thoughts turned to a different time, a different land, to the north, where he had sought not conquest or vengeance, but escape. He had wandered for longer than he could remember, crossing seas and mountains, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the ruin of Greece. Whether he had been running from his past or toward some unknown future, he could not have said. Perhaps both, or perhaps neither, a man simply walking, one foot before the other, with no destination in mind beyond the next horizon, until he had found her. Faye. The memory of her face surfaced in his mind, clearer than many of the others. She had been gathering herbs in a forest clearing when they first met, her movements calm and deliberate, a woman entirely at home in the wilderness, that would have challenged lesser beings. The dappled sunlight filtering through ancient pines had caught in her auburn hair, had highlighted the quiet strength in her features, the watchful intelligence in eyes that had already seen more than most mortals could comprehend. She had looked up at his approach, her hand moving subtly toward the axe secured at her belt, not in panic, but in the measured readiness of someone accustomed to danger. Yet she had shown no fear despite his imposing presence, his obvious foreignness, the aura of barely contained violence that had followed him even into this self-imposed exile. Instead, there had been curiosity in her eyes, and something else, a recognition perhaps, not of who he was, but of what he carried within him, of what they might become to each other, given time and trust. Neither was prepared to offer easily. "You are a long way from home, stranger," she had said, her voice carrying an accent he had not heard before, musical yet sturdy like the land itself given voice. He had not replied. Words had never been his strength, but he had stopped walking for the first time in what felt like years, had stood at the edge of her clearing, neither advancing nor retreating, a tacit acknowledgement that he had entered her territory and would respect its boundary. Their second meeting had come weeks later, after he had established a crude shelter in a different part of the forest. He had been tracking a deer when he found himself unexpectedly in the same clearing. She had been there again, though this time she sat on a fallen log, skillfully working a piece of leather with bone tools, transforming the raw material into something useful through practiced movements. "The stranger returns," she had said, without looking up, though he had made no sound he was conscious of. "Have you found what you seek in these woods?" "I seek nothing," he had answered, his voice rough from disuse, the words awkward in his mouth after so long in solitary silence. She had looked up then, her eyes meeting his directly, unafraid of what she might find there. "Everyone seeks something," she had countered, "even if it is only absence." The insight had unsettled him, this perception from a woman who knew nothing of his history, yet somehow recognized the nature of his wandering. He had turned to leave, uncomfortable with being seen so clearly, with the possibility of connection when isolation had been his chosen penance. "The storm comes soon," she had called after him. "Your shelter will not withstand it. There is a cave 2 miles north, where the stream forks around the standing stones. It would serve you better." He had paused, surprised by the offered help, suspicious of it, as he had grown suspicious of all unexpected kindnesses. But when he had glanced back, she had already returned to her work, apparently unconcerned whether he heeded her advice or not. This absence of agenda, of hidden motive, had been so unfamiliar that he had not known how to respond except with a brief nod before continuing on his way. The storm had indeed come, more ferocious than he had anticipated, with winds that threatened to uproot the ancient pines and rain that fell with the intensity of spears driving into soil. His shelter, constructed with more consideration for concealment than structural integrity, had begun to collapse around him in the early hours. Almost against his will, he had found himself following her directions, fighting through the cave she had mentioned. He had found her there already, a small fire burning near the entrance, cast in its orange glow as she calmly prepared a meal from provisions stored in a bark container. She had looked up at his arrival, water streaming from his massive frame, and had simply gestured toward the fire. "The gods must favor you," she had observed as he cautiously approached. "Few find their way through such weather without their guidance." "The gods favor no one," he had growled, the words emerging before he could consider them. They use mortals for their amusement, nothing more. Instead of taking offense, she had studied him with increased interest, as if his bitterness revealed something significant. You speak from experience, she had noted. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. Yes. The single word had carried the weight of centuries, of betrayals and losses, of a vendetta that had consumed his life and ended the lives of gods and mortals alike. She had nodded, accepting this without pressing for details he would not have provided. Then you have learned what many never do, despite lives spent in devotion. She had offered him a wooden bowl filled with some kind of stew, the steam carrying scents he did not recognize but found unexpectedly appealing. Here, the gods are different. Not better, perhaps, but different. More distant in some ways, more present in others. He had accepted the bowl cautiously, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange, a momentary contact that should have meant nothing, but had somehow registered as significant, like the first tentative step onto a bridge spanning an uncrossable chasm. The food had been unlike anything he had tasted before, flavored with herbs and spices particular to these northern lands. He had eaten silently, allowing the simple act of nourishment to ground him in the present moment, to briefly quiet the ghosts that followed him ceaselessly. "You have a name?" she had asked after the meal was complete, as they sat watching the storm continue its assault on the world outside their temporary shelter. He had considered not answering, maintaining the anonymity that had become both shield and prison during his years of wandering. But something about her directness, her lack of fear or judgment, had made evasion seem unnecessary, even cowardly. "Kratos," he had said finally, the syllables of his own name strange in his mouth after so long without hearing them spoken. "Faye," she had responded simply. Then, after a pause, "Rest, Kratos. The storm will pass by morning." They had not fallen in love quickly or easily. Trust had come slowly for both of them. Two solitary beings with secrets buried deep, with scars both visible and hidden. Weeks had turned to months, occasional encounters evolving into deliberate meetings, shared meals becoming shared hunts, brief conversations lengthening into discussions that revealed compatible perspectives, despite vastly different backgrounds. The fire dipped momentarily as another gust of wind found its way into the cave. Kratos added another log, watching as the flames caught and climbed once more. The Leviathan axe gleamed in his hands, its surface now wiped clean, its edge perfect. Faye's final gift to him, a weapon meant not for conquest, but for protection, for survival in this harsh land she had called home. When she had placed it in his hands for the first time, teaching him its ways, he had felt something shift within him. This was not a weapon bound to him by dark pacts or divine chains. It had not been forced upon him or accepted in desperation. It had been given freely, with trust, a choice rather than a sentence. And then there had been Atreus. The boy's birth had changed everything, had given Kratos a purpose beyond mere existence, beyond the endless walk away from his past. From the first moment he had held his son, small and fragile yet surprisingly strong, Kratos had known a new kind of fear. Not the fear of defeat or death, which he had long since made his companions, but the fear of failure in this newest and most important role. Father. Faye had been the one to name him Atreus, after a Spartan warrior she said had been known for his kindness as much as his strength, a quality she hoped their son would inherit. Kratos had not corrected her, had not told her he had known the man himself, had fought alongside him in campaigns long buried by time. Atreus of Sparta had indeed been kind by the harsh standards of their culture, but he had also been fierce, loyal to the death, a worthy namesake. The years that followed had been the closest to happiness Kratos had known since childhood. A small cabin in the woods, isolated from the troubles of gods and men, with a wife who understood silence and a son who filled it with questions and laughter. He had built the life with his hands, each log of their home placed with care, each hunting trip providing food for their table. Simple, tangible, real in a way godhood had never been, but the peace had been temporary, as he had always known it must be. The gods, it seemed, were jealous in every land, under every name. Faye's death had been the ending of that brief season of peace, the beginning of a new journey, unexpected and unwanted. They had burned her body on the pyre he had built, Atreus standing solemn and confused by his side. Her final wish, to have her ashes spread from the highest peak in all the realms. A simple request that had led father and son into the complex politics of gods, giants, and ancient prophecies. Kratos set the Leviathan axe down carefully, his maintenance complete. All three weapons now lay before him, gleaming in the firelight, each representing a different chapter of his long existence. The blades of chaos, his past, his sins, the rage that had defined him for so long. The Leviathan axe, his present, his responsibility, the path he now walked, not alone, but as a father. And between them lay an empty space, the future, yet to be determined, yet to be armed. He reached for the small pouch at his belt, withdrawing a cluster of dried herbs Faye had taught him to recognize. Casting them into the fire, he watched as the flames turned briefly blue-green, filling the cave with a sharp, clean scent that cleared the mind and fortified the spirit. Another of her lessons. Simple magic for practical purposes, so different from the grandiose displays of power he had witnessed on Olympus. The strength of this land is in its subtlety, she had told him once, as they stood watching the northern lights dance across the winter sky. Its magic does not announce itself with thunder and lightning. It seeps into bone and blood, works its changes slowly, steadily, like water shaping stone over centuries. He had not fully understood her meaning then, perhaps he still did not. But he had begun to respect the quiet power of this place, so different from the sun-baked marble and olive groves of his homeland. The north had its own gods, its own rules, its own dangers, but it had also offered him a second chance, however brief, at something resembling a life rather than mere survival. The distant sounds of preparation for battle grew momentarily louder as the wind shifted again, carrying with it the clank of armor being donned, the metallic singing of weapons being tested, the low murmur of voices offering final instructions, or perhaps last prayers to gods who rarely answered. By dawn, the forces would be positioned, the conflict inevitable. This fight was not of his choosing. Few truly were, despite what he had once believed about forging his own destiny. But this time, he fought not for glory, or vengeance, or even survival alone. He fought for Atreus, for the future of a boy who still had the chance to become something better than his father had been. Kratos had left his son sleeping in a secure location further up the mountain, a decision that had prompted argument, as most decisions involving the boy's safety now did. Atreus had grown not just in stature and skill since their journey to Jotunheim, but in confidence and determination as well. No longer content to simply follow his father's commands without question, he pushed boundaries, tested limits, sought reasons and explanations where once he would have accepted authority without challenge. I should be with you. Atreus had insisted when Kratos announced his intention to scout the enemy's position alone. We're stronger together. You've said so yourself. It was true. He had said those very words, had recognized the unique strengths their partnership brought to any conflict. The boy's archery had improved remarkably, his command of runic magic growing with each passing month. His ability to understand and translate the various languages they encountered had proven invaluable countless times. Yet still, Kratos found himself instinctively shielding his son. Not from all danger, for that was impossible in the world they inhabited, but from unnecessary risk. From battles that could be faced alone. There are preparations I must make, Kratos had answered, his voice revealing none of the complex emotions beneath the simple statement. Alone. The boy had studied him with those eyes that sometimes seemed far older than his years, that hinted at the ancient bloodlines converging within him. You're going to do the thing again, aren't you? Where you sit and remember all the worst parts of your life before a fight. The observation had been so unexpectedly accurate, so devoid of childish misunderstanding, that Kratos had actually blinked in momentary surprise. When had the boy become so perceptive? When had he learned to see through his father's stoic exterior to the rituals and habits that maintained it? It is necessary, was all he had said in response, neither confirming nor denying the assessment. But it had been enough. Atreus had nodded, a gesture eerily reminiscent of Faye in its quiet understanding, and had stepped back. I'll be ready when you return, he had promised. Be careful, father. That simple instruction, be careful, still echoed in Kratos' mind as he sat before the fire. Such ordinary words, spoken by countless ordinary parents and children throughout the realms each day, yet from his son's lips they carried weight beyond their syllables. Be careful, return, survive, stay. They were the words of someone who had already lost one parent and feared losing another, who understood mortality not as abstract concept but as lived experience. Kratos closed his eyes, his posture straight despite the weariness that ran bone deep, that had accumulated not over days or years, but centuries. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw them all, the faces of those he had lost, those he had killed, those he had failed. His first wife and daughter, forever frozen in that moment of horror and recognition. The countless soldiers who had fallen before his blades, gods and titans alike destroyed in his relentless campaign of vengeance. Family, enemies, innocents caught between. The weight of the past pressed down upon him like the sky itself, a burden he had carried for longer than most men lived. But then, emerging from that crowd of shadows, came Faye's face. Not as she had been at the end, weakened by illness, but strong and fierce as when they had first met. Her eyes held no judgment, no accusation. They offered instead a certainty he had rarely felt, that despite all he had done, all he had been, she had seen something in him worth loving, worth trusting with their son. The measure of a god is not in his strength, she had told him once, when he had lost his temper over some minor frustration, not knowing, or perhaps knowing precisely, the weight those words would carry for him. It is in what he chooses to destroy and what he chooses to protect. The fire crackled loudly, bringing Kratos back to the present moment. He opened his eyes, his decision made, though he had not been consciously deliberating. He would use both, the blades of chaos and the Leviathan axe, in the coming battle. not one or the other, not past or present, but the whole of his experience, the entirety of who he had been and who he was becoming. He rose to his feet, his joints protesting slightly, a reminder that despite his godly heritage, his body inhabited the mortal world, subject to its demands and limitations. The countless battles, the endless walking, the weight of weapons and armor, all had left their mark, not in weakness, but in the deep, persistent ache that had become as much a part of him as his red tattoos. Standing at his full height, Kratos rolled his massive shoulders, feeling the familiar pull of scar tissue across his back. His body bore the record of his life more honestly than any scroll or saga. Each mark a chapter, each healed wound a lesson. Some had been inflicted by enemies, others by those he had once called allies. The deepest, perhaps, had been self-inflicted, though whether by blade or by choice remained a distinction without difference. Moving to the cave entrance, he looked out over the moonlit landscape spread before him. The night air carried a sharp cold that cut through even his considerable tolerance, honed through years in these northern lands. His exhaled breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the wind, ephemeral as mortal lives. In the distance, torches moved like fireflies as forces gathered, their movements betraying purpose and preparation. Beyond them lay mountains still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, their peaks reaching toward stars that were beginning to fade as night retreated. The terrain below was familiar to him now, the dense pine forests, the frozen lakes that shattered like glass under sufficient force, the rocky outcroppings that provided vantage points for those who knew where to look. So different from the olive groves and marble temples of his homeland, yet he had learned its ways, had adapted as he always did. Survival demanded nothing less. His gaze swept systematically across the landscape, assessing approaches, identifying potential ambush points, calculating distances with the practiced eye of a warrior who had seen more battlefields than most men had seen sunrises. The coming fight would be neither simple nor brief. The forces gathering below were substantial, their purpose aligned against his own. But he had faced worse odds, had stood alone against gods and walked away, bloodied but unbroken. Still, something about this particular conflict sat differently within him. Perhaps because Atreus would be fighting at his side. No longer the novice boy struggling with bow and confidence alike, but rapidly becoming a skilled warrior in his own right. Pride and concern warred within Kratos' chest at the thought. Pride in his son's growing capabilities. Concern for the dangers that would inevitably find him because of who and what he was, because of who and what his father was. The wind changed direction suddenly, bringing with it new scents. Pine resin, wood smoke, the metallic tang of weapons being prepared, and, beneath it all, the faint smell of fear emanating from the gathered forces below. They knew who approached. The ghost of Sparta's reputation had spread even to these distant lands, carried on the whispers of those few who had faced him and survived to speak of it. The highest peak in all the realms, they had reached it. He and Atreus had fulfilled Faye's final wish after journeys that tested them both in ways neither could have anticipated. The scattered ashes had caught the wind, carried upward as if drawn toward Jotunheim's endless sky, toward ancestors who had awaited her return. In that moment, watching the last physical remnants of his wife disappear into the vastness, Kratos had felt something shift within him. Not the closing of a wound, for some never truly heal, but a changing of purpose. An ending and a beginning, wrapped together as tightly as the threads the Norns were said to weave. But the journey had revealed far more than either had anticipated. The truth of Faye's heritage as one of the Yotar, the giants whose conflict with the Aesir had shaped the very geography of these realms. The revelation that she had known their path all along, had marked the trees to guide them after her passing. And most significantly, the truth about Atreus himself. The boy was not simply his son, he was Loki, child of prophecy, foretold in ancient murals and whispered legends, destined to play some role in the coming Ragnarok that would destroy and remake the world. The revelation had shaken Kratos more than he had shown, had stirred memories of other prophecies, other destinies, that he had both fulfilled and defied through the sheer force of his will and the depth of his rage. After all his efforts to escape the manipulations of gods and fate, to find himself and his son enmeshed in another divine drama seemed a cruel joke. A reminder that some chains could never be truly broken, only exchanged for others. The irony was not lost on him, that in seeking to flee the world of gods and their schemes, he had unwittingly stepped into another pantheon's machinations, had fathered a child whose very existence was entangled with cosmic events beyond any mortal's control. Had Faye known this when they met? Had she sought him out specifically, recognizing something in him that would serve her people's purposes when combined with her own bloodline? The question haunted his quieter moments, rising unbidden in the spaces between thoughts, in the silence before sleep claimed him. He had no answer, might never have one, and had come to accept that some mysteries would remain unsolved, some wounds unhealed, some questions unanswered. Yet this time was different. He was different. The centuries had changed him, not always visibly, not always for the better, but undeniably. The rage still lived within him. It always would, as essential to his being as blood and bone, but it no longer ruled unchallenged. Beside it now stood other forces. Determination, certainly, but also something that might be called wisdom, hard-won through centuries of mistake, and something else, something he had once thought burned out of him in the fires that had claimed his first family. Love. Complicated, imperfectly expressed, but real. For Atreus, for the memory of Faye, perhaps even in moments of rare honesty with himself, for the man he might yet become. A faint lightening of the eastern sky caught his attention. Not dawn yet, but its promise. The battle would begin soon. He turned back to the cave, to the weapons that awaited him, each carrying its own history, its own burden, its own power. The blades of chaos seemed to pulse as he approached, as if sensing his proximity, eager for the combat to come. Once, their hunger had matched his own, a perfect symmetry of weapon and wielder, both consumed by bloodlust. Now he recognized their eagerness but did not share it. He would use them because he must, because some enemies could only be defeated by fire and fury. But he was no longer defined by what destruction he could reap. Beside them, the Leviathan axe waited, its presence cooler, steadier, a counterbalance to the blade's heat. Faye had wielded it before him, had imbued it with her own strength and purpose. When he held it, he sometimes felt her guidance still, subtle as a shift in wind direction, showing him not just how to fight, but why. Kratos gathered the weapons methodically, securing each in its place, the axe at his back, the blades at his sides. The familiar weight settled onto him, not comforting exactly, but right, necessary. His fingers traced the scars on his forearms where the chains of the blades of chaos had once bound him. Flesh and weapon made one through divine cruelty. The physical wounds had healed long ago, leaving only the raised, reddened skin as testament. The deeper wounds remained. He paused at the fire before leaving, looking down into the flames that had witnessed his night of remembrance. The northern lights had taught him that fire need not only destroy, it could also illuminate. Perhaps memory served a similar purpose, not merely pain to be endured, but light by which to see the path ahead more clearly. With a gesture, he extinguished the fire, plunging the cave into near-darkness, relieved only by the faint pre-dawn light finding its way through the entrance. It was time. The past had been acknowledged. The future awaited. Between them stood only the present moment, the eternal now, in which all battles were ultimately fought and all choices made. Kratos stepped out of the cave into the cold morning air, his breath visible in clouds that dispersed quickly on the wind. Below, in the valley, movement had increased. The preparations were complete, the confrontation imminent. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, centering himself as Faye had taught him, finding the quiet space within the storm that always raged inside him. When he opened them again, his gaze was clear, focused, resolved. The ghost of Sparta had been many things in his long existence. Warrior, slave, god, destroyer, wanderer, husband, father. Today he would be what the moment required, what Atreus needed him to be. The weight of the past remained, would always remain, but it no longer bent his shoulders. Instead, it had become the foundation upon which he stood, facing whatever came next. The sun's first ray broke over the eastern mountains, catching on the blade of the axe at his back, sending a flash of light across the valley like a signal. In that moment of illumination, Kratos began his descent toward the battlefield, each step measured and deliberate. The god who had once sought to bring Olympus crashing down now moved with purpose toward a different kind of fight. One fought not for vengeance or glory, but for a future he might never see. Behind him, the cave stood empty save for the lingering scent of fire and the invisible weight of memories confronted. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, the possibility of failure that haunted every battle. But between past and future, in the perfect clarity of the present moment, the path was clear. One step, then another. The weight carried, not discarded, the lessons learned, not forgotten. This was not redemption. Kratos had lived long enough to know that some debts could never be fully paid, some wounds never completely healed, but it was perhaps something equally valuable: continuation. The chance to be more than the sum of past mistakes. The opportunity to ensure that Atreus would inherit not just his father's strength and scars, but also the wisdom that had come at such terrible cost. As the distance between Kratos and the cave grew, the weight of the weapons at his back and sides settled into familiar balance. The blades of chaos, forged in underworld fires and stained with countless deaths. The Leviathan axe, born of ice and purpose, a protector's weapon. Past and present, destruction and preservation, rage and love. Not opposing forces, but complementary ones, like the dualities Faye had so often spoken of. The sun continued its ascent, casting long shadows westward as Kratos made his way down the rocky slope. With each step, the memories that had consumed his night vigil receded, not forgotten, but properly placed, behind him, informing but not determining what lay ahead. The battle awaited, his son awaited. Whatever came next, he would face it not as the god of war or the ghost of Sparta, but simply as himself. Kratos, carrying the weight of all he had been, moving toward what he might yet become. The distant sounds of preparation grew louder as he neared the valley floor. Voices calling orders, metal striking metal as final adjustments were made to armor and weapons. The nervous whinnying of horses sensing the tension in their riders. The familiar symphony of pre-battle, a music Kratos had heard more times than any mortal could count. But this time, as he walked steadily toward what awaited, something was different. The rage still burned within him. It always would, but alongside it burned something else. A clarity of purpose, a certainty, not of victory, but of necessity. He fought now not because he knew nothing else, not because bloodshed was his nature, but because there were things in this world worth protecting, worth preserving, worth the weight carried and the price paid. Ahead, the first figures noticed his approach, turning to watch as the pale warrior with the red markings came down from the mountain. The ghost of Sparta, the god of war, the father of Atreus. Kratos, and so our journey through the realms draws to a close for tonight. May Hypnos, god of sleep, watch over you as you drift through dreams of legendary proportions. If these tales of gods and monsters helped guide you to restful sleep, consider supporting our journey by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support gives me the strength to continue sharing these stories night after night. Remember, these videos play uninterrupted through the night, with no ads to disturb your slumber, just the soothing sounds of mythic realms to accompany your dreams. For those seeking passage to exclusive content, our Patreon offers early access to all videos and special playlists crafted to enhance your sleep. The link awaits in the description below. Until our next journey together, may your sleep be deep, your dreams be mighty, and your rest be undisturbed by the conflicts of gods and men. Sleep well, brave one.